I was standing beside my brother the night everything changed for him, and I confess I nearly missed it. We had arrived at Harwick Hall uninvited, or rather, uninvited by the man who believed himself its rightful master that evening, a Lord Cresswell who had called a gathering of creditors and hangers-on under the pretense of a supper. My brother, the Duke of Duskmore, did not attend suppers he had not been invited to. He attended only when he had business, and his business that night was a debt that had been owed to our late father's estate for 9 years, a sum a certain Sir Avery Ray had been delaying, contesting, and renegotiating with infuriating ingenuity across nearly a decade. My brother, Aldrich Vane, had tired of ingenuity. I followed him because I could never quite help it. He moved through a room the way a cold wind moves through a doorway. You feel it before you see it, and everyone near the door braces without knowing why. He was 34 years old and had never smiled in a room of more than 4 people, and I say that not to diminish him but to describe him with perfect accuracy. He was the most feared duke in the county, which in our county was saying something, because the county contained 2 other dukes, one of whom had personally reduced 3 barristers to tears in a single sitting. Aldrich had never needed to reduce anyone to tears. He simply looked at them until they arrived there of their own accord. He arrived at Harwick Hall, handed his coat to a footman, and proceeded directly toward the dining room without acknowledging anyone who greeted him. I followed, nodding apologies as I went. What we found in the dining room was not what we expected. I had expected Sir Avery Ray, a stout man of 60-odd years with small eyes and an enormous appetite for other men's patience. What I found instead was his daughter. She stood at the far end of the long table, not seated but standing, because there was nowhere for her to sit. The dining chairs were occupied by creditors and their wives, by men with ledgers and women with sharp eyes, and she had been placed. There is no kinder word for it, placed at the end of the table nearest the door. Holding a tray she had clearly just been told to carry, her face composed into the particular expression of a woman who will not allow herself to show what it is costing her to stand in this room, among these people, in this capacity. She wore a gown of plain gray wool that was clean and carefully pressed, and her hair was arranged with a precision that must have taken her the better part of an hour. She was perhaps 22, with dark eyes that moved across the room steadily, and a posture so correct it might have served as a lesson. She was not a servant. Every person in the room knew she was not a servant. That was, I believe, the point. I heard Lord Cresswell, wide and red-faced, seated at the head of the table with a glass that wanted refilling, say to the man beside him, "The girl carries the tray well enough. She may yet have some utility." The man beside him laughed. I glanced at my brother. Aldrich had not looked at Cresswell. He had looked at the girl. He was watching her the way he watched a detail in a contract he had not yet decided to contest, not with warmth, not with anything I could easily name, but with attention of a quality I rarely saw him give to anything outside the pages of a legal document. She had not seen him. She was making her way around the table with the tray, and she was managing it with a composure that I found, even then, quite extraordinary. I leaned toward Aldrich. "We're here for Ray," I said quietly. "I know why we're here," he said without looking away from her. Sir Avery Ray himself entered from a side door 10 minutes later, flushed and unsteady in the way of a man who had been drinking somewhere private, and was not as well hidden by it as he believed. He saw Aldrich immediately, and his color shifted from red to a shade of white that I can only describe as alarming. He made his way over with the rolling gait of a ship in uncertain weather. "Your Grace," he said, "I was not, that is, I had not expected." "No," Aldrich agreed. "Where are your papers?" That was how my brother conducted himself in rooms with people he did not like. Other men made pleasantries, circled toward the subject, gave the other party time to gather themselves. Aldrich asked where the papers were. I watched Ray's daughter set down the tray on a sideboard and step back against the wall, her hands clasped in front of her. She was watching her father now. Her expression had changed, not to fear exactly, but to something I recognized from having known Aldrich for 34 years. The expression of someone who has already calculated the worst likely outcome and is deciding how they will bear it. The negotiation that followed was not pleasant, and I will not dwell on it at length. The debts were real, the documentation was unambiguous, and Sir Avery Ray had been avoiding this reckoning for 9 years on the strength of legal delays, resubmitted disputes, and at least one extremely creative claim of personal hardship that had sent our solicitor home with a headache lasting 3 days. What Ray proposed, and this is the part I will not omit, because it is the whole of the story, was not a payment. He did not have a payment. What he proposed, with the glazed confidence of a man who believes himself more clever than the room, was an arrangement. "My daughter," he said, "is unmarried. She is young, accomplished." "No," said Aldrich. Ray blinked. "Your Grace, if you would allow me to." I said no. Aldrich set down the paper he was holding. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He said no the way a door closes completely. "Whatever arrangement you are about to propose, the answer is no. You will not offer your daughter as settlement of a debt. Not to me, not to anyone in this room." There was a silence of considerable weight. I glanced toward the far wall. The girl Ray's daughter had gone very still. Her eyes were on my brother, and there was something in her face that I could not entirely read. She had not expected that. No one in the room had. "Then what?" Ray began. "The sum outstanding is £812, Aldrich said. "I will accept a structured repayment principle only over 5 years. You will sign the revised terms tonight. Your solicitor can review them in the morning, but the signature happens tonight." He reached into his coat, produced a folded document, and placed it on the table between them. "You will also," he added, "cease instructing your daughter to serve at your creditor suppers. She is not a housemaid, and you know it, and so does everyone in this room." Lord Cresswell made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Aldrich turned and looked at him. Cresswell did not make another sound. I have often thought, since that evening, about what it cost my brother to do what he did next. Aldrich Vane did not do things by half measures, and he did not make gestures that he did not intend to stand behind. He crossed the room to the sideboard where the girl had set down the tray, and he said, in a voice designed to carry exactly as far as the entire table, "Miss Ray, will you allow me to escort you from this room?" She looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at a door that has unexpectedly opened in a wall you believe to be solid, with surprise and a careful assessment of whether it is real. Then she said, quietly and without any of the gratitude or the relief he might have expected, "Only if you intend to leave as well, Your Grace. I will not be escorted to a side room while this company continues." There was another silence. And then my brother did something I had not seen him do in a very long time. He very nearly smiled. It was the smallest possible movement at the corner of his mouth, a fraction, a ghost. And then it was gone, and he said, "Quite right," and offered her his arm and walked her out of the dining room and into the hall, and did not stop walking until they were outside the front door and in the cold night air. I followed them naturally. She thanked him. She did so precisely, not effusively, not with the elaborate gratitude that some women deploy as a kind of armor, but simply, "Thank you, Your Grace. That was not something you were required to do." "No," he agreed. "My father will sign your papers tonight," she said. "He'll be frightened enough to—" She paused. "He ought to have signed them years ago. I have told him so." Aldrich looked at her. "You have been managing this." It was not a question. She heard that and answered it straight. "Since my mother died, 4 years, he is not a wicked man, only a weak one where money is concerned. I have done what I could." "And tonight?" "Tonight was Cresswell's idea," she said. "He told my father that I might—" She stopped. She drew a breath and began again, with the precision of someone who refuses to allow the ugliness of a thing to defeat her in the retelling of it. "He suggested to my father that I might improve my prospects by making myself useful at his table. My father thought he meant serving." She paused again, and I understood from her expression that she knew perfectly well what Cresswell had meant, and that she had understood it from the moment she was handed the tray, and that she had decided to carry it with complete dignity because there was no other acceptable option available to her. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of making a scene. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you be safe tonight?" "Yes," she said. "Cresswell will say nothing to my father. He is too worried about his own investments to risk it, and my father will sign your papers and go to bed." She looked at him steadily. "I am quite capable of managing what comes after, Your Grace. I have been doing so for some time." He believed her. I could see it. He believed her not in the way men believe women to be capable when they are being gracious about it, but in the actual way, the way you believe a statement that is simply true. He nodded once. She said good night and went back inside. We drove home in the dark, and Aldrich said nothing for the entire journey, which was 20 miles, and I have ridden 20 miles in silence with my brother before, and it has never felt quite like that. Usually his silences are resting silences. This one was not resting. This one was thinking. I did not ask him what about. I knew better. He called on her 3 days later. Not on Sir Avery, on her. He sent a note addressed to Miss Elspeth Ray, inquiring whether she would be willing to receive him on a matter of some importance, and he received in return a note so brief and so precise that I had to read it twice to fully appreciate it. She would receive him at 2 o'clock on Thursday. She did not ask what the matter was. I was not invited to accompany him, and he did not invite me. But I am not without resources, and I have a long friendship with Aldrich's valet, Marsh, who told me afterward what could be told. He went. He sat in the Ray family's modest drawing room, which had been arranged with evident care on a limited budget. The furniture old but polished, the fire modest but adequate, a small arrangement of dried flowers on the mantelpiece that managed, against significant material odds, to suggest a kind of considered quiet dignity. She had made tea herself, Marsh told me, because their one housemaid had been let go in October, and they had not been able to afford to replace her. Aldrich asked if the debt repayment papers had caused her father any further difficulty. She said they had not. She said her father was relieved, actually, that a fixed sum with a fixed schedule was cleaner than the arrangements he had been managing, and that she had already begun reordering the household accounts to accommodate it. She said all of this matter-of-factly, as though managing a household's finances while a creditor held a structured repayment over the family was the ordinary business of a Tuesday, which for her, I gathered, it very nearly was. He asked, and this, Marsh said, was the moment when the afternoon shifted. He asked if she had any help. She had looked at him. What sort of help? Of any sort, he said. Anyone you are able to call on should circumstances become uncomfortable. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, quite plainly, "You are the first person to ask me that in 4 years. The answer is that I have managed without, and I expect I will continue to." She looked at him steadily. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" And he had said, and I believe this, because it is exactly what Aldrich would say, and exactly how he would say it, because I could not think of a better reason to be anywhere else. She had not answered that immediately. She had poured tea into the second cup and handed it to him and said, "That is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in recent memory or the strangest, and I am not yet certain which." He had smiled. Marsh confirmed it, a real one, not the fraction I had seen at Harwick Hall, but an actual smile, the kind Aldrich had not deployed outside the company of people who genuinely knew him since before our father died. "It may be both," Aldrich had said. He came back the following Tuesday. I know this because he told me, and because Marsh told me, and because several people who lived between Duskmore and the village saw the Duke's carriage heading toward Ray House at the same hour on Tuesday, and remarked upon it in the way that small communities remark upon patterns that deviate from the established ones. Aldrich had not, in 7 years, called on anyone at home on a Tuesday. He had called on barristers and estate agents and solicitors, and on our mother before she died, and he had attended 3 weddings and 2 funerals, and 1 christening he had not been given sufficient notice to decline. He had not called on a young woman in her drawing room on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and returned the following week. People noticed. I was not people in this context. I was his brother. I understood that something had shifted, and I was not going to remark upon it prematurely and drive it underground, because Aldrich, when observed too closely, had a habit of retreating from a thing he had not yet decided to commit to, not because he was a coward, but because he was very cautious with things that mattered. I had seen him abandon perfectly good decisions simply because someone expressed enthusiasm about them before he was ready to. So I said nothing and watched and waited. And the Tuesday after that, I should explain something about my brother, because otherwise the speed of what happened next is too easy to misread as something it was not. Aldrich was not a man given to sudden feelings. He had been engaged once a long time before to a young woman of very good family who had found, on closer acquaintance, that she preferred a man who spoke more and smiled more and brought flowers on Wednesdays. She had not been cruel about it. He had not been wounded in the way people expected. He had simply closed. Not bitterly, not dramatically, but with the efficient finality of a man tidying an account he no longer needed to keep open. He had gone about his affairs and managed his estates and been feared across the county, and never, in 7 years, given any indication that any of this cost him anything. What he felt for Elspeth Ray was not sudden. What was sudden was only his recognition of it. He told me so later, after it was all settled. In the quiet way he told me the things he was willing to say aloud. I think I decided at Harwick Hall. I did not know that I had decided until I was 3 weeks into calling on her and realized that I was not calling on her for any reason I had intended. What he had intended, he said, was to ensure she was safe. What he discovered Tuesday by Tuesday was that she did not require ensuring, that she was the most thoroughly competent person he had spent time with in years, and the most honest, and that her particular brand of composure, the kind that had carried that tray around a room full of people who ought to have been ashamed of themselves, was not fragility dressed as strength, but strength that had simply never needed to announce itself. She had a mind she used with precision. She read. She argued points she believed in. She did not flatter him, and she did not appear to find him frightening, which in his experience was an accomplishment achieved by very few people who knew him beyond a handshake. I met her on his 5th visit. He brought me, finally, and introduced me without preamble. My brother Edmund. He has been attempting to hear your account of Harwick Hall from a secondary source, and I thought it more efficient to allow him to meet you directly. She had looked at me with a very slight widening of the eyes, and then said to Aldrich, "You told him about Harwick Hall and he has questions." "He always has questions," said Aldrich. "I have many fewer questions than I did," I said. "Meeting you has answered most of them." She smiled. It transformed her face in the way that a window opened onto a garden transforms a room suddenly and completely. "I hope the answers are satisfactory." "Entirely," I said, and I meant it. What I saw that afternoon was not only a woman of considerable capability. I saw what she did to my brother, which is what I had been trying to understand from a distance and could not, until I watched them together across a modest tea table in a modest drawing room. She did not soften him. That would be the wrong word for it. She steadied him. He was already still. He had always been still in the way of a deep current that does not disturb the surface. But beside her, that stillness became something different. It became, for lack of a better word, inhabited. And I watched her carefully, too, because I was not about to allow my brother to attach himself to a woman who did not see him. What I saw was that she saw him. Not the title and not the feared reputation and not the long silences and not the lack of social warmth that alarmed most of the county. She saw Aldrich, the actual man with the actual code he lived by and the actual intelligence beneath the coldness, and the actual constancy that most people never stayed long enough to find. When she disagreed with him, and she disagreed with him with a pleasant regularity, she disagreed with him the way you disagree with someone whose opinion you take seriously. She did not soften her disagreements, and she did not perform them. She simply said what she thought and waited for him to respond. He loved that. I had never seen anyone love anything as quietly and as wholly as Aldrich loved that. Sir Avery Ray, for his part, said nothing about the visits and nothing about his daughter's new Tuesday caller. I suspect he understood, somewhere behind the debt and the wishful thinking, that interfering was not in his interests. He also, I think, did not fully comprehend what was happening, which was perhaps merciful, because had he comprehended it, he might have managed to make it worse. The difficulty, because there was a difficulty, and it was not small, was that Elspeth Ray did not believe, for several more weeks, that any of this was what it appeared to be. I understood why. She had been managing a failing household for 4 years. She had been offered as a kind of settlement by her own father. She had been stood in a room full of creditors and handed a tray. She did not assume, as a baseline, that powerful men who appeared in her drawing room on repeated Tuesdays were there for the reasons they appeared to be there. She was too honest for that kind of assumption, and too cautious for the kind of hope that assumes goodwill before it has been sufficiently demonstrated. She said as much to Aldrich eventually. I know this because he told me afterward in the way he tells me things that matter, plain and brief and without drama. She had said she thought well of him. She liked his company. She was not certain she trusted the shape of the situation, and she would not pretend to be certain of something she was not, because she had found that pretending to be certain of things was how her father had ended up owing the Duke of Duskmore £812 over 9 years. Aldrich had said, so he told me, I am not asking for certainty, I am asking for the opportunity to give you reason for it. She had considered that for a moment. That is, she had said, either very reasonable or very dangerous. I am generally regarded as dangerous, he said. I would like to be reasonable for once. What followed was not a declaration in a drawing room with a shocked assembly looking on. That is not who they were, and it was not what either of them needed. What followed was simply more Tuesdays, and then Thursdays as well, and conversations that ranged across the management of the Duskmore drainage problem, which Elspeth had a clear view on, and across the question of her father's household budget, which she allowed Aldrich to see because he asked directly, and she had decided she was not going to pretend to him. And across the matter of a book on agricultural reform that she had read and had opinions about, and that he had also read and had different opinions about. And they argued it pleasantly for most of a Thursday afternoon until the light failed and she stood to light the lamps herself, because there was no housemaid to do it, and he stood and lit the nearest one for her, and neither of them mentioned it. Then a morning when he arrived to find her in the kitchen garden at Ray House, because the kitchen garden was the one part of the property that was genuinely producing, and she managed it herself. And she had not expected him until noon, and there was a moment. Marsh was waiting with the horses and saw it, where she straightened from the row of winter greens, pulling off her working gloves, and he was simply standing at the garden gate. And they looked at each other in the uncomplicated way of two people who have arrived at something without having had to say it yet. The morning was cold. Their breath showed in the air between them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and then she said, "You are early," and he said, "I know," and she nodded and came to the gate and let him in. He said it that afternoon. Not in the kitchen garden. In the drawing room properly, with tea that was already cold because neither of them had thought to drink it. He said he wished to marry her if she would have him, and he said it in the way he said everything, plainly, without ornamentation, but with a weight that made it clear it was not a thought that had arrived lightly. He said he knew the shape of the situation was a strange one. He said he knew she had been offered as settlement, and he wanted to be explicit that this was not what he was doing. He said he was asking her because she was the person he wished to spend his days beside, and because he thought, if she was willing, that they might be of genuine use to each other in the way that mattered. She had looked at him for a long moment, then she had said, "The way that matters." "Yes," he said. "Not the way that looks well in a room, or satisfies a creditor, or provides an heir on schedule." "No," he said, "the way that means something." She had been quiet. He waited. He was very good at waiting, my brother, he always had been. He did not fill silences to relieve himself of them. He waited, and she thought, and then she said, "I do not know how to be a duchess." "I know how to be a duke," he said. "It has been of limited value to me. I suspect between us we will manage." She had smiled. He told me she had smiled, not the quick, brief smile she deployed at the edge of difficult situations, but the one that opened her face completely, the garden window one. She had said, "Yes, Aldrich, I will marry you." He came to find me that same evening. He arrived at my house without sending word first, which for Aldrich was approximately equivalent to another man arriving with a brass band. He stood in my study doorway, still in his riding coat, and said, "She said yes." I said, "I know." "You cannot possibly know." Marsh told my groom, and my groom told my valet. I poured him a glass of something appropriate. "I have known for 40 minutes. I have been wondering what was keeping you." He sat down, which he almost never did in my study without being invited. He accepted the glass and looked at it and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "She asked me if I was certain." I waited. "I said that I had never been certain of very many things," he said. And she said that was the most honest answer I had ever given her, and that it was enough. I looked at my brother, this man who had moved through rooms like cold weather for the better part of a decade, who had never asked anyone for anything, who had spent 7 years being feared and found it satisfactory, and never admitted even to himself that satisfactory was not the same as good. He was holding a glass of brandy in my study, and his entire face was different. Not soft, Aldrich Vane would never be soft, but open, in a way it had not been in a very long time. The way a door is open when someone has unlocked it from the inside. "Good," I said, "she is right." They were married in February. Elspeth Ray became the Duchess of Duskmore on a gray morning with a brief, cold sun, in a church on the edge of the estate, with perhaps 30 people in attendance because Aldrich had no interest in a spectacle, and Elspeth had said plainly that a large wedding would require a great many people she did not know to look at her while she was doing something private, and she preferred to do private things privately. He had agreed without needing to be asked twice. It was, by any measure, one of the most reasonable conversations I had ever heard two people have about a wedding. She wore a gown of ivory wool, simply cut, with her hair dressed with the same precision I had first seen at Harwick Hall. She carried no flowers. She looked at my brother the entire way up the aisle with the same direct, clear, considering attention she had given everything since I had met her, not with tears, not with trembling, and when she reached him she said, quietly enough that I nearly missed it, "There you are." And Aldrich, the most feared duke in the county, the man who had not smiled in a room of more than 4 people in 7 years, said quietly back, "Here I am." I gave the toast at the wedding breakfast because Aldrich could not be trusted to keep it to under 400 words, which is a kindness I have always extended to him when it is required. I said that my brother had spent a great many years being formidable, and that it had served him well, and that he had now found someone who found formidability neither impressive nor alarming but simply accurate, and that she was the first person in my experience who had managed to look at Aldrich Vane with the same clarity he brought to everything else, and that I thought that was the most useful and the most generous thing one person could do for another. Elspeth, from across the table, looked at me with her clear dark eyes and said, "That was kind, Edmund." "It was true," I said. "I try to avoid saying things simply because they are kind." "I know," she said. "I have noticed. I believe, and I say this as the man who knew him best and watched all of it from a reasonable distance, that Aldrich Vane had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who would look at the world as precisely as he did and not flinch from it, and sit beside him in it, not to soften it, not to glitter beside him in it, but simply to be in it with him in a way that meant something. He had found her carrying a tray in a room full of people who should have known better. She had found him at the door she had not expected to open. When I think of that evening at Harwick Hall now, the gray wool gown, the composed face, the tray carried with perfect dignity, I think that she had already decided, before my brother ever opened his mouth, that no circumstance was going to strip her of herself. And I think Aldrich saw that in the first 10 seconds and has never once looked anywhere else since. He told me on his wedding anniversary the year after, when I asked him what had changed, meaning in him, in his life, in the quality of the silence in his house on the evenings when it snowed, he said, "Everything is the same, only now there is a reason for it." I thought that was one of the truest things he had ever said. Elspeth, passing through the study doorway at that moment with a letter she intended to post, heard the last of it and said, without stopping, "He says that as though it is a small thing." Aldrich watched her go. "It is not a small thing," he said. "No," I agreed, "it is not."